Okay, so we are getting ready to move on to what I call the isms: modernism, phobism, cubism, expressionism, futurism, Dadaism. There are all these um, eras or art historical movements that take place in the modern era. And so I highly suggest that you write down each of the movements on a piece of paper and then write down the key hallmarks that go with those movements. It's important because it's a lot of information and you may have a difficult time keeping it organized. It's definitely something that you're going to need for the final. All right, so Fauvism is characterized by the things that I have bulleted here on the PowerPoint. So, explosive colors and blunt brushwork, the juxtaposition of colors that are opposite on the color wheels, so they have a disharmonious color scheme, blatant disregard for local color, study in the psychological of color juxtapositions, no white or black. Artists who were popular during this time were Matisse, Marquette, and Roulet. Fauvism itself meant wild beast. It's still regarded art as a precious object. They formed a group that opposed the official Paris Salon. They simplified objects and schematized them. They tended to paint things that were pleasant, and the bright colors tend to flatten the space in terms of value variation. So, in the summer of 1905, Andre Derain leaves for Paris for a 2-month stay with his friend Henri Matisse. They settle in a small fishing town of Collier. It's on the southwest coast of France near the Spanish border. The painters had first met in Carrier's Paris studio. Matisse's encouragement, Derain wanted to pursue a career in art and art theory. He paints canvases that are filled with bright light color. They were exuberant with broken brushwork, which also interested Matisse. Along with another artist named Maurice de Valmenic, there were major proponents of short-lived movement known as Fauvism. Movement was termed fauves, which means wild beast. It was attached to the artists because there was a show, and during that show, an art critic coined the works of art fauvist. The initial show of this type of work shocked and offended most of the viewers. In 1905, they exhibited at the Salon in Paris and were rejected by the Parisians. Matisse and Derain worked closely together in the small fishing village, but their styles did not overlap each other. They remain distinct to themselves. So when you look at Derain's work, you can see a difference in his work versus Matisse's work, partially because Derain mostly sticks to landscapes. His works of art have people in them, but they tend to be busy doing things. He really liked movement in his art, Andre Derain did. And so his work tends to be more rhythmic. The lines and colors tend to rotate in a more regular pattern. His palette is fauvist. It has a vibrant and unnatural feeling to it. He was somewhat dissatisfied with his painting, and you could kind of feel it in terms of tension because the colors are opposite on the color wheel. Um, the brushwork has a sense of division to it that makes the painting feel flat and as if he's relying heavily on the outline to create the image distinction. So you see that the sky has an outline for the clouds. The mountain here is outlined at the edge of the green with a darker blue. You can see that the ships tend to be outlined with the bright brown and then the blue that goes next to the sail. Durain eventually decides he wants to turn away from Fauvism's ideas and go on to produce more monochromatic works like the Cubists. This is another one of Durain's works where he is exploring the landscape and the mountains. You can see how he relies on that outline between the orange and the blue to create the shape of the mountain, as well as the short broken brushwork in the foreground of the picture plane to create the trees and the grass. Valmanek was a self-taught painter. He really had this unbridled passion for spontaneity, and so he wanted straightforward forms, things that were pretty plain in terms of the object itself. So the sailboat, he doesn't put in all the detail of the boat. He just simply creates the shape. He liked basic hues to express his feelings. He said, I try to paint with my heart and my guts without worrying about style. The Parisian art dealer Ambrose Villard purchased Valmanek's existing stock of paintings in 1906. And he was able to then devote himself fully to painting after André Villard purchased a large body of his work. He spends the summer of 1906 around the area in which Van Gogh paints. He really admired Van Gogh. He liked the fact that he combined primary colors like blue in with white and red. And so Valmanek applies his colors directly on the canvas right out of the tube, thinking that he's going to get a more broken brushwork like Cézanne has. He's going to end up, we're talking about Van Gogh, aren't we? That he's going to end up with these nice bright colors that Van Gogh has. You can kind of see that here in this work of art if you think back to what Starry, Starry Night looks like. Starry, Starry Night combines yellow and blue and green and white to create a dynamic composition with movement. And you can see in Valmanek's work that he gets an overall sense of movement. Definitely nothing like Durain gets in terms of color placement and rhythm. But you definitely can see a sense of movement within the broken brushwork. You get this sense of direction, even though things don't feel like they're moving swiftly like we see in the works of art by Van Gogh. Well, the main leader of the Fauves was Henri Matisse. Matisse says what characterizes Fauvism was that we rejected imitative colors and that with pure colors we obtained stronger reactions. He was the leader of the Fauves, and he believed that color should be a major communication of meaning in a work of art, and it should serve as a form of expression, that art should form as a form of expression. He was a painter, sculptor, draftsman, and printmaker. He was continually searching for the same things which I have perhaps realized by different means. He was continually searching for new ways to present things, for new ways to communicate. He was celebrated as both an orchestrator of tonal harmonies, and he was a draftsman capable of distilling a form to its essentials. He long sought a way to unite color and line in his work. He was born in 1869 in a town in which the linen and weaving industry was the main industry. He was raised nearby that town in Bohine, which was famous for its luxury fabrics. This early exposure to textiles shapes his visual language, and I'll show you the work of art that I'm thinking of that really makes a difference for him in terms of textiles. He had a collection of textiles in terms of art. They were in the forms of carpets and cloths, and he collected them from all over the world, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and they would deeply inform him in terms of, or deeply influence him in terms of color and pattern and composition. Okay, so this is Henri Matisse's The Joy of Life. It is a large pastoral landscape that depicts the Golden Age. The figures appear flat due to the fact that they don't have a lot of value variation. There is no specific light source, and all the colors are highly chromatic. The other thing he does is explore the relationship between line and color, just as we saw in the dance. Only here, it's a little bit more sophisticated, it's a little bit more daring, and the figures are a little bit more detailed. You can see a couple at the front of the picture plane. There's a sense of distortion of spatial reasoning between the figures. He emphasizes expressive color, meaning that he utilizes the color to communicate what he's trying to get you to look at in the work of art. He's drawing on the folk art tradition, that's the use of unmodeled form and strong outline. Colors are highly expressive, and the goal of the Fauvists was to shock the viewer when they looked at the art, and so he does this pretty well in terms of subject matter as well as color and composition. The Paris Salon, like I told you before, rejects the art of the Fauvists. This is a portrait of Matisse's wife. She sits in the typical manner for a portrait from the time, but the colors that he uses seem to be random, and they're meant to startle the viewer. You can see that she has a confrontational look on her face, and Matisse handles the paint and textures in a rough way. They're sort of quickly applied, and they're done so in sections so that the areas feel somewhat chunky. The way he handles paint, line, and texture in this composition are very confrontational. They have a jagged sense to them. They tend to move the eye around the canvas, and they have a complete disregard for local color, but also Matisse is responding to the fact that she's wearing something with color on it, and that the color is reflecting in the light off of her skin. In 1908, Matisse writes, "The basis of my thinking has not changed, but my very thinking has evolved, and my means of expression have followed on." This idea of a new way of seeing is something that Matisse sticks to wholeheartedly. We talked about his influence of being born in an area or living in an area that is highly influenced in textiles and in textile manufacturing. This image is where I think all of his research and color, all of his study and how line and color reacts, culminates into an apex in his work. You can see the table and the wall are painted in the exact same color. While the tablecloth seems to have some sense of dimension, in that the pattern seems to crawl up and backward. In addition to, he has some things that are sitting on the table that help to define the plane of the table as receding into space. However, when you look solely at the linear work and the composition, the linear work fools the eye enough to think that the composition is fairly flat. In addition to the addition of the window that is green, tends to pull the viewer's eye backward. Without that flat green area, your eye would not be able to comprehend the fact that this pattern is a pattern that recedes into space and that the table actually is a table. The line work, I believe he's looking at fabric and how the fabric reacts, how the pattern on the fabric reacts to moving backward into space. You can see that here again, he relies a lot on the definition of the positive and negative definition of space. So you've got this organic looking scrolly line that goes along the painting in blue, and then the red touches the scrolly line and helps that negative space feel curvilinear. The woman who is the subject of the painting, which I suppose is arguable, you could argue that the subject of the painting is actually the line work, but the woman who sits the vases on the tablecloth defines the edge of the table. Without her and the yellow chair that recedes into space, you would once again not be able to tell that this tablecloth recedes into space. Every single thing that Matisse has used or added into the painting has a very specific purpose design-wise. Without those objects being there, what Matisse was trying to communicate would not come forth visually. The year that he creates this, he turns a motif common in his works, which is a room decorated with vases, fruits, and flowers, into a more complex subject matter by exploring these different formal elements within his compositions. The artist himself calls this a decorative panel and not a painting. It was intended for a dining room in a Moscow mansion of a famous Russian collector. And I want you to remember that without Andre Villard or some of the other contemporary collectors of art, the artists that were exploring new ways of looking at things would not have been as successful. In order to be an artist that has a unique voice and makes a contribution to the history of art, or to art and its history, a collector has to have enough buying power to make it a collectible theory or thought process. Same way with the antique market. People have to all of a sudden create a drive for the kind of art or the kind of antiques that they wish to collect. Without the collector, the artist without the patron does not make the kind of headway in art that he wants to. Okay, so let's talk about Cubism. Cubism has two forms, analytical cubism and synthetic cubism. Analytical cubism is the typical thing that you typically think of whenever you're talking about cubism. It's this work of art that tends to be done in browns and whites and blacks. It has a very monotone color palette, and it seems to be very angular. And it doesn't seem to have a whole lot of recognizable imagery in it. It was pioneered by two artists named Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. And Duchamp's Nude Descending the Staircase #2 was a very important piece of work in Cubism, even though we typically classify Duchamp as Dada. Sources of inspiration for analytical Cubism were Einstein, who discovers the theory of special relativity about space and time continuum at this time in the history of art. Picasso and Braque are friends. They meet together at a cafe, and due to their collaboration, Cubism is formed. Synthetic Cubism is a type of Cubism that tends to be colorful. It incorporates ideas of the collage. Picasso creates glass in the bottle of Suze and mandolin and clarinet. And Braque also explores synthetic Cubism. Artists see this type of presentation of the form as a way to express a new approach to art. New things are being invented in society and technology. There's a lot of new technology coming about. The Industrial Revolution has happened, even in fashion. Like, I don't know if you know this, but World War II or World War I was when women started wearing undergarments, like brassieres, because they were made so that the women could work and wear a uniform. So all kinds of new things are changing. And because of the new changes and because of new scientific discovery, artists are discussing these philosophies, the new styles, the new ideals, and they react to them. Picasso's reaction is a reaction to new technology. He discusses it with Braque. They all hang out at a cafe together called the Cafe Gats. And there they sort of work out their ideas. They discuss them, they process them, and then they go back and work in the studio and take it back to the studio with them. They all influence each other, not just the Cubists. The Fauvists have their opinions and they influence each other. The Futurists have their own opinions and they influence each other. This is Picasso. He was the leader of the Cubists. He works closely with Georges Braque to develop analytical and synthetic Cubism. He and Braque are friends. They meet at the Cafe Gats. They spend a lot of time discussing their ideas about Einstein and the theories of relativity. Not all of Picasso's works, though, were Cubist. Some of them were likened more to Surrealism. Others were a result of synthetic Cubism. Picasso's legacy includes the use of found objects for art, as well as using non-traditional materials such as cardboard for art. I know that doesn't seem like a big deal. We see artists use all kinds of things now for art, especially in the contemporary art scene. But Picasso really was the first one to come along that said, hey, why can't we use cardboard? Or, hey, why can't we use newspaper or wallpaper or whatever we want to? We're artists, so we should be able to use all kinds of things. And so Picasso really introduces this idea of being able to use found objects as an artistic medium. This is Gertrude Stein. Stein is posing here with the portrait that Picasso painted for her. He painted this particular work of art in 1905. Stein fuels Picasso's career. When he gave Stein her portrait, he creates this image of her, but he dislocates and fractures her face. She's skewed. The face has different planes. He was inspired by pre-Roman occupation and Celtic sculpture in Spain. He had a revelation The revelation was that a face could be constructed differently than just in the Roman canon that they had been learning. Picasso was formally trained. His dad was a art professor, and his abilities really far surpassed his dad's at a young age. But the person who fueled Picasso's career was really Gertrude Stein and her brother, who collected art. Picasso respected her very much. He really only respected men in terms of contributions and in terms of, not just in terms of contribution, but in terms of scientific discoveries, in terms of ideas. He respected mostly only men. He looked at women as an opportunity for a muse. He looked at them as beauty in the world, but he just didn't look at them as equal. He was married 4 times. His relationships really affected his life and his art. We'll talk about them more and more as time goes on. When he paints Stein, he paints her with man-like qualities. He does this by using a wider stature for the painting. He broadens the frame and makes her seem harsh and brash. She sits forward in the painting as if she's engaging. This is the painting La Vie. La Vie was painted in Picasso's blue period. In French, La Vie means the life. Picasso does this painting in 1903. After Picasso took his very first trip to Paris, he returns home with his friend Carlos Casagemas, and shortly after, Casagemas commits suicide. This launched Picasso into a very deep depression. The deep depression was, I think, caused by trauma that Picasso went through as a child. He had a sister. His mom and dad had a baby, and the baby died. And his dad left the marriage when the baby passed away. And so he sort of works out how he's feeling in this work of art in the blue period. There is a self-portrait of Picasso in this work of art. You can see it here. This is the male figure standing in the image is Picasso. He is talking to his mother, and his mother's holding the baby, and then he has a young woman by his side. We don't know whether the baby was the infant that his mom lost as a child. We don't know. We do know that he struggled a lot in his life with depression, and he goes into a deep depression over grieving for his friend Carlos Casagemas. He was only 20, and he was very poor. And so part of the reason he restricted his color palette, we think, was just simply because it seemed easier. But he was trying to communicate the melancholiness that he was feeling for because of the death of his friend Casagemas. He was very obsessed with themes of human misery and social alienation. He often, I think, felt alienated from society. His mom and his aunt raised him. because his dad had left the picture. But I know that he still had a relationship with his dad because his dad taught art, and he did art with his dad. So this is one of my favorite images of Picasso's. It's the Sultan box, and it is part of Picasso's Rose period. So I told you there are two distinct color periods that he goes through. First is the blue period, which I showed you two pieces from, and the second is the rose period. The rose period, even though I know this particular work doesn't look like it's heavily influenced by the color rose, is definitely part of his rose period. The Sultan box really stood for the melancholy or the neglected underclass of the European lifestyle. They were circus performers, and they were the rejected in society. They were often the ones that were nomadic. They were people who traveled from place to place, and they were a family. They all stuck together and were important to one another, but because they all stuck together in a troupe and they never really settled for a long period of time in one place, without each other, they really didn't have a lot. Picasso seems to be able to identify with these people. He enjoys being in their company. He enjoys studying their life, and he paints an image of them. The image that he paints is a family portrait of them. You see the gesture in the big red suit, and Picasso paints a self-portrait of himself in the painting. This is him dressed as the Harlequin. The Harlequin is the gesture or the funny man of the circus. And so he identifies well with the Harlequin figure. The Harlequin is often one that makes light of a very depressing situation. And I think oftentimes he feels just rejected in society and is able to identify with that feeling of being on the outskirts of the society. The family the Sultan box pays tribute to the circus's stocks players, the ballerina, the tightrope walker, while also serving as an autobiography. You will find that a lot of Picasso's paintings, including La Vie, serve as autobiography for Picasso. Picasso is a very emotional person, and he works out that emotion on the canvas in his paintings. Some of his paintings are almost as if he took emotion. He sort of vomits emotionally all over the canvas. And then we as viewers tend to sit back and make sense of that. For example, in this particular work of art, he has this dark, brooding silhouette of the Harlequin. He's in this diamond print costume. He's painted in the dark. And he has this vision of himself as sort of a dark person on the outskirts of society. We have done many scientific studies of Picasso's work, including La Vie, and the original tonality in this particular painting was blue. He started out in the bluish part of the blue period, and then paints over top of it some of the rose tones. When we do the x-ray of this painting, we see that Picasso alters the figures and the composition and switches from blue to rose, consequently allowing the darker paint to show through as he works the canvas. In this way, he creates a contour as well as a dusky veiled atmosphere. And that dusky veiled atmosphere seems to create these figures that are somewhat waif-like. I would say one of the more famous of Picasso's work is this one, De la Maison d'Avignon. He is painting in the prostitution scene in Barcelona. He's taken that show that he saw in 1902 in Paris and utilized the planar analysis of the face to discuss a new way of seeing. For some art historians, they feel that this is the very first Cubist work created by Picasso. Others feel that the collaboration between Baroque and Picasso hasn't divulged far enough for us to consider this to be completely Cubist. We get interesting aspects of Cubism in the work, though. He is interested in cultures that are not influenced by the Western world and that are influenced by colonialism. He's interested in fragmented planes of color and shifting viewpoints. He incorporates the tension of the two versus three-dimensional state of being. So two-dimensional is something that's completely flat, a canvas painting or a piece of paper, a drawing on a piece of paper, whereas three-dimensional is something like a sculpture. And so because of that, it seems to feel, it seems to have this bridge. It seems to be in a gap in between the two. Picasso hires the prostitutes to be models. You can see them standing here in the painting, sort of grouped together. In certain places, Picasso keeps the portrait somewhat grounded in two-dimensional plane. You can see the left side of the canvas has this blocky looking leg that he really doesn't seem to finish. There are areas of the canvas where he focuses on the planes and how they react with one another. This really is a sheer analysis of the form. He paints the women and has become enamored with the planar effect that he sees when he looks at them. And he's fascinated by being able to show multiple viewpoints. Cézanne was the one who influenced the different viewpoints that he had. Cézanne was the one who allowed Picasso to be able to see that you can paint things in the same painting from different points of view. That's not typical of formal artistic training. And so Picasso sees new opportunities for the way we see things. He went in 1906 to a retrospective of African art again, and it affected him very deeply. And so he brings it back to the painting that he's doing. He creates ethnographic museums. He creates ethnographic paintings when he goes to the museums and sees the African masks. He creates a new sense of canon, a new way to approach the figure, and he wants to tear down the old way of portraying things. He wants to use African art to do it. And so he paves the way for Cubism in this portrait. George Baroque then paints Violin and Palette, and he takes it to Picasso, and they spend a lot of time together talking about the violin and palette. Barak was trained as an interior decorator, and in 1900 he moves from Paris to meet the Fauvists and begins painting with them. Picasso knows the Fauvists, and he has met Barak through this association with them. They all spend time together in this cafe in Montmartre called the Café Gatz, like I explained earlier. The Café Gatz is a wonderful place for sitting and just discussing philosophies in life. Somewhat like the modern-day coffee house, it was a place in which they could gather and discuss scientific theories and innovations coming up in the world. They could talk about philosophy. They could talk about writing. It wasn't just visual artists who gathered. It was all sorts of like-minded individuals who wanted to discuss their philosophies and viewpoints. They all very much influenced each other. And after after Barak sees Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, he paints violin and palette in collaboration with Picasso. Picasso then takes their abstraction a step further and paints Ma Jolie. Ma Jolie means my beautiful, and this officially launches Cubism as a movement. Here they paint the fractions of what is seen. They are rearranging them, though, when they paint the fragmented form and put them in an interesting and pleasing arrangement. They both felt that art should be a representation of reality. This is a very important key point, and it's the point of why Picasso would not join the Surrealist movement. He felt that he wanted his work to be grounded in reality. He wanted it to be based on what it is that he saw in front of him. And he really felt that art should be a representation of reality. This was as far as anyone could take something in reality in terms of exploration of the form. They really felt that they have taken every ounce of possibility in terms of depicting what a violin looks like sitting in front of them and pushed it to its ultimate maximum. It is a reflection of what Picasso sees. He's painting a girl and a stringed instrument in a way his mind takes in the model and processes it. Therefore, it becomes unreal in that it's not actually something that exists in real life. It did at one time, but not in that form. But it is still very much something that is grounded in a concrete visual representation. But then Picasso decides that he's exhausted Cubism. And so he realizes that there's another face to Cubism that he's not capturing here, and that is synthetic Cubism. Synthetic Cubism relies more closely on the recognizable object. Picasso feels that there's no such thing as completely abstracted art, because all art begins with something. And so he decides that he's going to start experimenting with collage. This is a collage, and here he's trying to represent a tabletop with a glue bottle sitting on top of the table. He flattens out what looks and is looking at still life composition. And so he flattens out the composition and tilts the table towards the picture plane. And then he uses collage to create the rest of the painting using bits of newspaper article, bits of wallpaper, construction paper. He's so good at this collage technique that there are places where it is very difficult to tell whether or not he has painted the newspaper or if it's an actual newspaper that sits in front of you. Really good collage. is collage that is represented this way, where you can't tell the difference between the painted part and the part that was found object. He is a pioneer of this. And for those of you or those of the world that think that Picasso couldn't paint or that they just don't get Picasso's work, what I would tell you is he is good enough to represent an object in its reality that he can fool you into thinking that object is there. And that the thing that you're looking at is really a piece of cardboard and not his painting, when in all actuality it is paint. To really understand Picasso's collages, you have to see them. You have to be able to see and detect the difference between the surfaces. You have to see them in front of you. The Columbus Museum of Art has a Picasso that is a collage. They have several Picassos. As well as, if you ever get a chance to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, I encourage you to go see Picasso's work, as well as the MoMA, the Modern Museum of Art in New York City. The Guggenheim has a lot of his blue collection. The first time I ever saw a woman ironing was at the Guggenheim, and is really a breathtaking piece of art. But don't miss the work of art that's spectacular and underneath your nose in Cleveland, which is La Vie. This is Pablo Picasso's guitar. Picasso was not only a painter, he was a printmaker as well as a sculptor. And what he does in painting, he does in sculpture, which is taking material that's never been used for in the history of art and creating a precious object out of it, a precious object of art. This is a guitar sculpture. There were many, many, many guitar sculptures, like enough that I have seen retrospects of his guitars all in one place, and there are like 50 or 60 of them. Picasso created art for a very, very long time. 70 years, I believe, he was actively creating art. He painted up until the day he died. And so we get an interesting record of Picasso's life and his scientific thinking, his way of looking at new things in a new way. And his sculpture is definitely a reflection of that. He starts casting in bronze, just like every other artist, and then he starts using newfound objects like cardboard to create the form. His idea here was, how much do I have to really include in the representation of the form to make this particular work of art or sculpture look like a guitar. Here he includes the front of the sound box and the shape of the guitar's body, which really is the thing that makes a guitar a guitar. When you see this hourglass shape, you automatically think of a guitar. The sound box and the hole that carries the sound is also very important, and so he includes those things. This is another one of Picasso's synthetic cubist pieces. It is one in which he incorporates more texture than what we've seen before, and he's adding more pattern and experimenting even more so with the collage in the newspaper. Analytic cubism was about breaking down an object, viewpoint by viewpoint, into a fragmentary object, whereas synthetic cubism was about flattening out the image and sweeping away the last traces of illusion of a three-dimensional space. And so he intentionally makes his works flat. He takes all of those pieces and lays them on a flattened plane so that you don't feel like the piece has depth. Now, in order to understand the collage, obviously the collage has a sense of depth because it has overlapping objects. But in this case, you can see how successful he is at creating something that is very flat. This is a tabletop scene with a fruit bowl, violin, bottle, and newspaper. It's constructed form of color that resembles cutout pieces of paper, but are actually constructed through paint. The background was left white, and Picasso and Barak are making collages and experimenting with that representation at this point. They soon begin to simulate the appearance of collage materials in their oil paintings. Sometimes they add to the paint and give it a heightened sense of reality. They'll add texture to the paint, various things of that manner. Do you feel that it contains inaccurate information or language that we should improve or change? So this is the last of Picasso's work that we're going to look at. It's kind of makes me sad because I love Picasso. I took an entire class on Picasso in graduate school. I know a ton about Picasso. And he is one of the greatest pioneers in the history of visual art. So it does my heart some sadness to think that we're going to quit talking about him. This is his Girl Before a Mirror. I have seen it before. It is at the MoMA. The girl that you see here is Mary Therese Walter, and it was painted multiple times. She was painted multiple times in the 30s by Picasso. Picasso was a really despicable human being in terms of women. He often used them as a muse, and then he would sort of... he would want her to carry his child, and then once she got pregnant, he would dump her and go find somebody else. Marie Walter was the only of his wives that ever divorced him. All the other wives he left before they left him. He had a really difficult time with losing her. But we know that he struggled with bipolar disorder. His last wife often recorded accounts that she would have a hard time getting him out of bed. He was very emotionally attached to his work. A good example of that would be Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. He would often take the paintings that were shown, and if they weren't received well publicly, he would hide them away. He had 4 or 5 houses, and in each house he would go in, set up a studio, work from one room to the next, and then eventually fill the entire house up with art to the point where you couldn't get any more art in it, and then he'd just leave the house and move instead of donating the art to a museum or whatever. Picasso was a successful fine artist in that he was able to show and sell his work, which is more than I can say for a lot of contemporary artists. But his art didn't start becoming so collectible or worth the amount of money that it's worth now until he passed away, which is sad but true for most artists. I'm happy to answer any more questions that you might have about Picasso, about his life. He really was a fascinating human being. He was a child protege in that his dad knew how very talented Picasso really was. So this is Picasso's Guernica. Guernica, I know I said we were going to be done with Picasso, but I forgot that we needed to go over Guernica. Guernica is a really important painting. It's important because it was a response that Picasso had to a tragic event that happened in history. It was a response to a fascist bombing in the southern region of Spain. There was an article in the newspaper, and that's how he found out about it. There were 25 bombers that dropped 100,000 pounds of explosives over an entire town. Fires burned in the town for 3 days, and a third of the population was killed or injured. The attacks seemed pointless and a display of fascist power to further the horror of the event. It was found out that the German officer that had planned the attack was for training purposes. And the fact that it was for training purposes really horrified Picasso. He was emotionally deeply moved by the incident. And so this piece was his reaction to it. It addresses the political role of art, and it was created for the Paris International Exposition. It had aspects of Cubism, but also aspects of Surrealism. It took Picasso 10 days to paint the piece, and it was rare for Picasso to use specific symbols for his art that had a message in them that were meant for the public. But in this case, he intended for the expressions of feelings on the faces to be personal feelings. It was his public stance to identify with socialism. The piece is monochromatic, which is the hanging on or anchoring to his Cubist tendencies, but it reveals a sense of brutality and darkness. The images that you see that have the texture on them are pieces of paper from the article that he read in the paper about the bombing. I just wanted to put this particular image in here so you could see that this painting is fairly large. It takes up an entire wall. It's definitely over 6 feet tall. I would say it's probably about 8 or 10 feet tall by about 12 feet wide, or maybe even 16 feet. All right, so let's talk about Expressionism. When we discuss Expressionism, we're usually looking at German Expressionism. They had a name called the Bridge Group, and they also used jarring and dissonant color and a jarring and dissonant color composition. They tried very hard to communicate the bad effects of industry and urban life. So this is one of those movements that is about the Industrial Revolution. It's a negative reaction to the Industrial Revolution. There's a magazine that is introduced called The Blue Rider. We see pure abstraction come from this movement, and we see spirit through color, line, space, and form. Science was definitely an influence on how Expressionism came to be. Kirchner was also a printmaker. I know it seemed like I was kind of hanging on the last slide. He had a mental breakdown late in his career, and he joined the war effort for some time. And because he had a mental breakdown while he was there, he spent the rest of his life pretty much trying to avoid the city as much as possible after that. This is Vasily Kandinsky. He is part of the Blue Ritter, part of the group that Kirchner came from. He comes to Munich in 1896, and he was very influenced by Russian lacquer paintings that portrayed folk tales. He goes to Munich, and he begins doing some work that is very expressionist. So let me tell you the difference between the abstract expressionist and the expressionist. Sorry. The expressionist, their work is smaller than the abstract expressionist artists. The abstract expressionist artists tend to use large gestures to create their works of art. So if it involves paint flinging, or if it involves a process that's much grander than the painting of a smaller canvas, then it tends to be abstract expressionist. In addition to, the abstract expressionists had a sense of a focus on the process of the work of art, of creating the work. Whereas Kandinsky isn't so much about the process in which he creates the work. He loved the color of the fauves, and he begins making paintings that fuse Russian folk tales and the fauves approach. By 1912, he's making big, bold, simple, distilled landscapes and vistas. They're hard to decode in terms of recognizable objects, and they look more like abstract images. This is improvisation number 28. It is a painting that was done in 1912, and we say that his paintings that were named after music, these non-objective paintings, were a major milestone because they're the first in Western art history. They're the first abstract thinking paintings. He makes these paintings while he's listening to music. He gives them musical titles, and he claimed that he was unconscious when he paints them. He says he becomes a conduit for energy, emerging while not under the conscious control. He also feels that the viewer is not able to understand his paintings through conscious control. He feels that we're only able to understand paintings when we are unconscious. He goes on an idea called synesthesia. Synesthesia is an overlapping of the senses. It's what does yellow sound like? What does blue taste like? When your senses mingle into one another, it's called synesthesia. And he believes he can induce synesthesia through substance. He says through substance, we tap into the universal psyche. He thinks that the tapping into the unconscious will help prepare society for something looming in the horizon. Improvisation 28 has a blending of senses. Can you guess what might be going on? Do you see any kind of recognizable imagery? Kirchner believes that his paintings are about destruction. He thinks that the world will end soon. And he thinks that these paintings will prepare us for the world becoming a different thing. Over the years, he predicted World War I. He said that this painting anticipated World War I. And it seemed as if he was prophetic in the sense that he predicts major world events. His synesthesia ideas were something that lots of people were drawn to. The Guggenheim, Peggy Guggenheim was a collector, an art collector. It's how the Guggenheim Museum got started. And Frank Lloyd Wright was asked to design the Guggenheim based on Kandinsky's paintings. They were to house the collection of canvases that Peggy Guggenheim had obtained from Kandinsky. And you notice that the paintings have a lot of grand movement to them. The idea behind the Guggenheim was that the painting's lines seemed like they could project forever. And so Frank Lloyd Wright wanted no harsh right angles. He wanted everything to gradually curve so it felt like the painting continued to move off of the canvas. Definitely a synesthesia reaction. Okay, so let's talk about Futurism. Futurism is a new era of art history characterized by formed moving in space. They picture the body moving or they like to picture the movement instead of the figure. They embrace speed and the ideas of the new mechanization of the Industrial Revolution, and they reject artistic and cultural traditions. They were mostly Italian, and they were communists, and they believed that technology was a good thing. So Baccioni is Italian, obviously. He tries to visualize in his head what the figure would look like if he were to just sculpt the air around the figure. And so he comes up with these sculptures that look like a figure moving in space, and it looks as if she's got on these weird angular clothes that cling to her body as she moves in space. Futurists in general explored lots of different types of medium. This is The Revolt by Russolo, and he tries to capture objects in space through painting. The futurist movement was about movement. It was about motion. They catch on to this idea that this is part of new technology. This is exciting part of the modern age. The works of art look like a blur of movement. They're a takeoff from the ideas of Cubism. They envied the open spaces of the United States. Europe, if you've ever been to Europe, is very closed in. They don't have as many large, wide open spaces that the United States does. They had the ideas of violent explosion and how to get rid of the old stodgy European ways. Stop action photography was also a heavy influence. Okay, looks like I've told you most of what I know about futurism. One of the more famous of the futurists was Brancusi. He was eager to show works that emphasized natural or organic forms. He wanted to capture the sense of an object or its spirit rather than the motion. For example, for Bird in Space, he uses a bird's wing at rest, and that is his beginning point for his sculpture. And then because he started at the beginning point of the sculpture being the bird's wing at rest, he develops it further and further to the point where the end result reflects, like in this case, Bird in Space, it feels bird-like. It feels like a wing of motion. You can see this, I think, more easily in his work, The Newborn. He was highly influenced by African art that was on display in the 1900s in Paris, the same African art that Picasso was influenced by. And he felt that the simpler form captured the nature of their subject more effectively. This rejected realism, and he begins making shapes that are the essence of their subject. The egg symbolizes birth and the potential for growth and development. The flat ellipse has a bauble in it, which represents the head of the infant at the moment of birth. To Brancusi, this was the essence of the perfect potential. Another one of the artists who sort of agreed with Brancusi was the English artist Hepworth. Hepworth combines shape and the sense of organic vitality, but emphasizes the element of mass. She wants to express both nature and landscape, and in 1921, she decides that she's going to use the use of the hole or the void. It takes on an elemental part of her sculpture, and it's an important switch because she is thinking about work in terms of mass, and she feels she needs to convey what a void looks like. And so for her, it looks like this hole in the object or the sculpture. She's intentionally embracing the idea of the void. Most modern sculptors until now, though, wanted to they wanted to not have any kind of hole in their work. And so this becomes her signature element, and she feels that she can convey better man and the landscape and man and nature in her work with the void. Henry Moore is British, just like Hepworth, and he shares her interest in the void, or the idea of the hole in the sculpture. His sculptures, though, have some interesting sort of bridges in terms of the form. Futurism was very much about the form. Henry Moore believes in expressing the form. But he pays special attentions to the qualities of the material that he's using. For example, in this case, wood. I did this nice close-up for you so you could see the wood grain, and you can see how the figure reclines and naturally lays based on the wood grain. Henry Moore said, "Material has its own individual qualities. It is only when the sculptor works direct, when there is an active relationship with his material, when material can take its part in shaping of the idea." He uses the grain of wood in this case to dictate how the figure moves in space. He or she reclines and sort of gracefully moves along with the grain of the wood. Moore was also inspired by Shamuel. Shamuel is a reclining figure in the Toltec and Mayan art of South America. Moore was known for working with the special qualities of textures of material. I've seen him do bronze. I've seen him do wood, stone. And so he really wanted to work with the material, but he also had a spiritual side to the works in which he feels like he's connecting to the Toltec and Mayan art. Here's another one of Moore's reclining figures. I just kind of wanted you to see how he utilizes that wood grain to dictate the form. So Dada is a movement that was started by a man named Hugo Ball. We'll talk about him in a moment. But Dadaism overall is an art movement that has a random, nonsensical feel that has no logic to it and not understandable in its concepts. The introduction of ready-mades was part of Dadaism. Marcel Duchamp creates the fountain. Man Ray is another Dada artist. It was fueled by World War I. It is a nonsensical response to the logic that caused the devastation of war. They basically felt like war was so awful and such a horrible thing that the only reaction they could have to it was a bunch of nonsense. Mechanization takes over, and it really provokes the question, what is art? This is Hugo Ball. Hugo Ball's performance was sort of the very first performance art ever. He creates an iconoclastic or epic, I suppose would be a more modern word, performance of a poem called The Caraway. Now, if you go on YouTube, you can actually watch a recording of Caraway. It was done in 1916, and Hugo Ball creates a costume that he wears made out of blue cardboard tubes. On his head, he wears a hat that is white and blue, and the critics called it a witch doctor's hat. On his shoulders, he covers them with gold-painted cardboard that flaps when he moves his arms up and down, and he slowly and solemnly recites the poem The Caraway, which consisted of nonsensical sounds. It was typical of Dada to have that sense of nonsensicalness. The performance was both critical and playful, and he wore lobster claw gloves on his hands. It had an element of sound to it because the flaps made noise as he moved his arms back and forth. Hugo Ball thus is considered the father of performance art altogether. And let's look at the other voices in Dada. This is Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending the Staircase number 2. Duchamp is highly influenced by Cubism, and so he paints this image of the nude descending the staircase. He submits it to the Armory show in the United States, and it's the first time that these type of elements are shown in the United States. The show, the Armory show, exhibits in New York City and moves to Chicago and then to Boston. So most major cities saw Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending the Staircase too. And the United States had a really hard time with these concepts and ideas. The Americans see Duchamp's ideas as the plummet of machinery. They tend to have this reaction of, what the heck is that? When looking at Duchamp's painting. Duchamp was probably one of the most important artists of the 20th century. He creates a new concept of art called a ready-made. A ready-made is art that is made from everyday objects that are mass-produced. So in this case, a bicycle wheel and a stool. They challenged the notion that art should be handmade and is a precious object. Duchamp's most controversial work of all was this work of art called The Fountain. So I guess I'll just tell you what I know about this fountain. So it was photographed by Alfred Stieglitz and then thrown away. It's been urinated on by a famous record producer. And sometimes it was cited as the work of a Bauhaus female artist rather than Duchamp. But Duchamp's fountain was really the first piece of conceptual art ever. It certainly was the most famous ready-made in the history of art. And it was inspired by many, many artists from modern and contemporary art, like Damien Hirst and Richard Hamilton. They interact with it in the most obvious way in terms of the gallery and the museum settings. it has these gently flowing curves that some people liken to a female object. It is not presented the way a urinal normally is presented on the side of a wall. Instead, it's laying on the side in which the urinal would be hung on the wall. Some people feel that it was the biggest scam that art ever considered to be art. Others feel like it's the biggest contribution of art in probably the 20th century. It was definitely a piece of work that only was in its original form for maybe for an entire show, maybe a year at most. What you see now is a replica of Duchamp's fountain. The original was long lost. Stieglitz photographed it and then it was tossed out. So why was Duchamp one of the most important artists of the 20th century? Well, he begs the question, what makes art art? It's one of the most important questions we can ever ask ourselves in terms of art. He first submits his work to the U.S. Armory Show when he submits Nude Descending the Staircase. Duchamp states that the idea for the fountain comes from a discussion that he's having with a famous collector, Walter Arzenberg, and the artist Joseph Stella, where he was in New York. He purchases the urinal from a sanitary ware supplier, and he submits it or arranges it to be submitted as a work of art, and he signs it Armat. He claims that because he signs it and changes the urinal's orientation, that he has created an artistic fingerprint. He arranges for it to be shown in a show that's being put on by the Society of Independent Artists. Duchamp himself founds the society and promotes the society as an objection to the Paris Salon's works or large shows. He is on the Society's board of directors, and the Society rules to accept all members' submissions, regardless of what the submission is. The common public conception about this is that it was an immoral and indecent work of art to be displaying in front of people, but in front of women in specifically. There was a discussion about the work of art amongst the board, and the directors decide that that they would definitely display it. Then, even though it was voted to be displayed at the show, the board it rules that it will be in an out-of-way space within the show. Duchamp was very upset about the fact that when the show opened to the public on April 10th of 1917, that it was not given a proper space in the show. And so he and Arzenberg, who he had sort of formulated this concept and idea with, resign from the board of directors, and the organization then folds because of it. The Society of Independent Artists fold because of it. It is a work of art that has been copied 17 times. The copies were approved by Marcel Duchamp, and they were all handmade, even though the original was something that he took from a urinal supply store. It was a very important work of art because it was the very first conceptual work of art in the history of art, and it laid the groundwork for modern day art that is done in a conceptual basis. One of those friends was Man Ray, who was a sculptor. He was an American visual artist who spent his career in Paris. He was a significant contributor to the Dada movement. Some people lump him in with surrealism. It just depends on how you want to look at him. He's not a big focus in your textbook, but it was something that I really wanted to go over with you because I really feel like Man Ray establishes a pattern of the artist being able to take elements that may not have been together at one time, puts them together in ready-made fashion and discusses it as a work of art. He never really considered himself a sculptor. He considered himself a painter above all things, but he was best known for his photography. He was a renowned fashion and portrait photographer, and he was noted for his work with photograms, which were called rayographs, in reference to himself. Here you see his cadeau, and it was done in 1921. It is a replica, as are most of the works of art that you see for Man Ray and ready-mades. Why? Because the original ready-made is the original work of art. So in order to get that exact ready-made, you can't take it then becomes the original work of art. So then you can't take a different iron and a different set of nails, put them together and say, this is Man Ray's cadeau. You have to have the one that Man Ray touched, the one that Man Ray put together. And so this becomes an interesting conundrum. If I put together, let's take the urinal, for example. If the art is this particular urinal, then if I take another urinal from the shelf and put it on display, is it Marcel Duchamp's urinal? The answer is no. And so they copy the works of art for exactly what they are. And a lot of those sculptures that you're seeing are copies of them. They are definitely a copy of an original work of art. The only woman that was allowed into the Dadaist movement's name was Hannah Hooch. She was known for photo montages that she created, and she was remarkable in the movement of Dada because of the fact that it was a nonsensical reaction to war, but she finds her voice to war in her work. This is her most famous work. It is a cut paper work of art. It is a collage. She uses media from mass-produced sources like the newspaper, like magazines, and she cuts out the images in the newspapers and the magazines, glues them down in different sizes, and creates a very important commentary on the society around her. She's an artist that reacts to social issues. She doesn't use them to make statements. She simply cuts the type out as image. She cuts the image out as image and plays with them in a collage. All right, so we got through Dada, and now we are moving on to abstraction. Abstraction is a work or a concept of art that is about non-objectivity, meaning that it has something in it that is not a recognizable object. Europe from 1900 to 1920 was reacting to supremacism. It had roots in utopian and idealistic societies. The abstract artists wanted to express reality as pure feeling. And so they create a set of art that is non objective, meaning the shapes are not relatable objects in the visual world. Basic forms for the artist were the square and the rectangle. But the one that we really call the father of non objective art is Arthur G. Dove. He was an American born painter who admired Cezanne. He took a trip to Europe in 1908 and stayed for an entire year. Upon coming back to the United States, he meets Stieglitz. Stieglitz grants him a solo show. Remember, he owns Gallery 291, and he has an interesting hobby. It is chicken farming. And so Dove, who wants to create non-objective art, creates a number of innovative works of art that use stylized abstract forms at a remarkably early date when you look at American art. He is the first American artist to have created such purely abstract, non-presentational imagery. He also dabbles in collage. He produces 25 of them in his career, and they all have personal meaning to his life. Some art historians say that Dove's collages were the most important body of collages done in the US before 1955. He was admired by artists like Frank Stella, who modeled some of his abstract expressionism after Dove's work. Here you see Arthur Dove's Nature Symbolized #2. It is a interesting play on positive and negative shape. It does feel as if it has some spatial depth to it, some recession into space. He does seem to stick to a marginal color palette when he does these earlier works. As he begins experimenting, he breaks out and does more colorful representation.